The dust of the Texas Panhandle doesn't just settle on the land, it settles on the soul. For Eliza May Thompson, it was a shroud threatening to bury her and her sick child Leo. With her husband gone and their homestead failing, every sunrise was a curse another day of staring at an empty pantry and a barren field. Hope was a currency she could no longer afford. That is, until a shadow fell across her doorway. A man on a fine horse, a rancher named Silas Blackwood, who offered not just a plate of food, but a paradise. A place where hunger and fear were banished. But Eliza would soon learn that some paradises have gates that only lock from the outside, and the price for her son's survival might be her own identity, her own sanity, and a secret buried under a lone willow tree that watered its roots with tears. The year of our Lord, 1885, had bled the Texas Panhandle dry. The sun, a merciless sovereign, rained from a cloudless white-hot sky, baking the plains into a cracked and crumbling wasteland. For Eliza May Thompson, the world had shrunk to the size of her failing 160-acre homestead, a patch of earth so parched it seemed to have forgotten the very memory of rain. The wind, its constant companion, was not a gentle breeze, but a rasping thief, stealing the topsoil and carrying with it the ghosts of failed dreams. Inside their sod-brick house, a dwelling that was more a part of the dying earth than a shelter from it, Eliza watched her son. 6-year-old Leo lay on a thin pallet, his breath a shallow rattling thing. His face, usually cherubic and smudged with the dirt of a boy's play, was now pale and drawn, his lips chapped and tinged with a faint blue. A fever clung to him, a dry heat that seemed to emanate from his very bones. It was the hunger sickness, she knew. The slow, creeping starvation that hollowed out the belly before it, hollowed out the spirit. Eliza's own stomach was a tight, aching knot, a constant reminder of their shared plight. It had been 2 days since their last real meal, a scrawny jackrabbit her late husband Caleb had taught her to snare. Before that, it was boiled shoe leather. Today, their entire larder consisted of 3 wrinkled potatoes, small as a baby's fist, and a handful of weevil-infested flour. Caleb was a ghost here too. His presence lingered in the sturdy axe handle, leaning by the door in the half-finished whittling of a wooden horse on the mantel in the way the floorboards creaked under her weight. He had been a man of boundless optimism, a farmer from Ohio, who had believed the pamphlets that promised a new Eden in the West. Just add water and faith, Eliza. He'd say, his smile as wide as the horizon. But the faith had run out with the water. A rattlesnake bite, swift and brutal, had taken him last spring, leaving Eliza to face the unforgiving land alone. She ran a damp rag over Leo's forehead, the water from their nearly empty barrel warm and tasting of alkali. "It's all right, my love," she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "Mama's here. Mama will find something." The lie tasted like dust in her mouth. She had prayed until her knees were raw and her throat was sore. She had walked for miles in every direction, searching for anything edible, any sign of life. But the land offered nothing. The nearby settlement of Dust Devil Gulch was a day's hard walk, and she had no money. Nothing to trade but the wedding band on her finger. A sacrifice she wasn't yet willing to make. It was the last piece of Caleb she had. Taking one of the precious potatoes, she peeled it with painstaking care, making the peelings as thin as paper. She sliced it and boiled it in their last cup of drinkable water, mashing it into a watery gruel. Leo managed a few spoonfuls before turning his head away, his small body rejecting even this meager offering. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the numb fog of Eliza's hunger. He was getting weaker. She could see it. She could feel him slipping away. Clutching the half-eaten bowl, she stumbled outside the harsh sunlight, making her dizzy. She sank to her knees beside the withered corn stalks, their brown husks rattling like skeletons in the wind. The despair was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, threatening to suffocate her. She bowed her head, the tears she thought had long since dried up, finally breaking free, carving clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "Please," she sobbed, her words swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence. "Somebody, anybody, please help us." It was then she heard it. Not the wind, not the scuttling of a lizard, but something new, a steady rhythmic beat. Hoofbeats. She scrambled to her feet, shielding her eyes against the glare. A figure on horseback was approaching, not from the direction of the gulch, but from the west, from the endless expanse of unclaimed territory. He rode not like a desperate farmer or a weary traveler, but with an easy confidence, his posture straight and commanding. The horse was a magnificent creature, a deep chestnut with a powerful chest, a stark contrast to the bony, exhausted mules that usually traversed these parts. As he drew closer, the details of the rider came into focus. He wore a dark, clean duster, a fine felt hat that shaded his face, and tall leather boots that shone even through the dust. He was no drifter. This was a man of means. He pulled up a few yards from her, the horse snorting and stamping impatiently. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that seemed to absorb the brittle tension in the air. "You appear to be in some distress." Eliza wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, suddenly conscious of her ragged dress and wild, unkempt hair. My son is ill, sir." She gestured numbly toward the sod house. "We have no food." The man dismounted with a fluid grace. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and tanned by the sun. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, seemed to see right through her to the very core of her desperation. There was an intensity in his gaze that was both unsettling and magnetic. "My name is Silas Blackwood," he said, removing his hat. "My ranch is a half-day's ride west of here. Blackwood Creek." Eliza had heard whispers of the Blackwood Creek Ranch, a veritable empire that had sprung up as if by magic a few years ago. They said the owner was a wealthy man from back east, a man who had more cattle than the Panhandle had stars. His eyes flickered to the bowl of watery potato gruel still clutched in her hand, then to the desolate farmstead around them. His expression was unreadable, a mask of calm composure. "A boy needs more than potato water to fight a fever," he stated, not as a judgment, but as a simple fact. He walked to his horse and unstrapped a heavy saddlebag. From it, he produced a canteen, a loaf of dark bread wrapped in cloth, a slab of smoked bacon, and a leather pouch that jingled with the promise of coffee beans. He laid them on the rickety porch bench as if it were a banquet table. Eliza stared, speechless. The aroma of the smoked meat and bread was intoxicating, a scent so foreign and so craved it made her head swim. "Please," he said, gesturing to the provisions. "For you and the boy." Tears welled in her eyes again, this time of profound, gut-wrenching gratitude. I have no way to pay you, Mr. Blackwood. I have nothing." Silas Blackwood's gaze drifted from the food to her face, then to the open door of the house, where the sound of Leo's weak cough could be heard. A strange, fleeting expression crossed his features, something akin to sorrow, or perhaps longing. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that same stoic calm. "Some things aren't about payment, Mrs. Thompson. Eliza Thompson. Mrs. Thompson." He continued, his voice softer now. "This land is hard. It takes more than it gives. I've seen too many good people broken by it." He paused, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "This food will last you a few days, but the fever will return. The hunger will come back. This land, it has no more to offer you." The truth of his words hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was right. This was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of grace in an endless cycle of suffering. "What you and your son need," Silas Blackwood said slowly, his voice dropping to an almost hypnotic cadence, "is more than just a meal. You need a sanctuary, a place to heal, a place where the well never runs dry and the pantry is always full." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, completely blotting out the harsh sun. Eliza felt a tremor of apprehension, a tiny alarm bell ringing in the back of her exhausted mind. His generosity was overwhelming, but there was something else in his demeanor, an unnerving intensity, a possessiveness in his gaze as it swept over her and her broken home. "My ranch has a place for you, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "A comfortable room, a soft bed, a doctor to see to your boy, 3 full meals a day, cooked by my housekeeper. You would want for nothing." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. It was an impossible offer, a dream whispered into the heart of a nightmare. To leave this place, to escape the dust and the hunger. For Leo to have a real chance. It was everything she had prayed for. But the question hung in the air, unspoken and heavy. Why? Why would a man of his stature make such an offer to a destitute widow and her child? Charity was one thing. This was something else entirely. "I don't understand, sir," she stammered, her mind struggling to catch up. "What would you ask of me in return?" Silas Blackwood smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his piercing blue eyes. He looked past her toward the dark interior of the sod house, as if he could already see Leo safe and sound within the walls of his own home. "I'm not asking for a hired hand, Mrs. Thompson," he said softly. "I'm offering you a new life. All I ask is that you accept it." He held her gaze, and in that moment, Eliza felt she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Behind her was a slow, certain death in the dust. Before her was a lifeline offered by a stranger whose motives were shrouded in mystery. But looking at his face and thinking of Leo's shallow breaths, she knew there was no real choice at all. There was only survival. The decision once made was followed by a surreal whirlwind of action. Silas Blackwood was a man accustomed to command, and the world seemed to bend to his will. Before the sun had reached its zenith, he had dispatched one of his ranch hands, a man who appeared as if from thin air, to ride ahead to the ranch with instructions. Eliza, in a daze, packed their few meager belongings into a single worn satchel. Caleb's whittled horse, a spare set of ragged clothes for Leo, and the tintype photograph of her and Caleb on their wedding day, its corners soft with handling. She refused to take her husband's axe. Leaving it felt like a final painful severance from the life they had tried to build. She did not look back at the sod house as Silas helped her and the weak, bundled Leo onto a sturdy buckboard wagon that another of his men had brought. To look back would be to acknowledge the totality of her failure, and her spirit couldn't bear it. She focused instead on the broad, straight back of Silas Blackwood, riding his chestnut horse ahead of them, leading them away from the dust. The journey was a revelation. For the first few hours, the landscape remained the same familiar, sun-blasted torment. But then, as if crossing an invisible line, the world began to change. They followed a dry creek bed that miraculously began to trickle with water. The trickle became a stream, and along its banks, the grey-brown earth gave way to patches of stubborn green. Cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering in the heat, offered pockets of deep, cool shade. The air grew heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and living things. By late afternoon, they crested a low rise, and the full scope of Blackwood Creek Ranch spread out before them. Eliza gasped. It was not a ranch. It was a kingdom carved out of the wilderness. Miles of irrigated fields, emerald green with alfalfa and corn, stretched towards the horizon. A vast herd of longhorn cattle, sleek and healthy, grazed peacefully in a pasture that seemed impossibly lush. The creek from which the ranch took its name was no mere trickle here. It was a wide, clear artery, diverted into a complex web of channels that gave life to the entire valley. And at the heart of it all stood the house. It was a 2-story timber frame structure, grand and imposing, with a wide veranda wrapping around its entirety. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, promising warmth and sustenance. It was a monument to wealth and power, a defiant fortress against the harsh realities of the Panhandle. As they pulled up to the main house, a man in a waistcoat, a doctor by the look of his bag, was already waiting on the porch. Silas dismounted and was at the wagon in an instant, his movements efficient and purposeful. "This is Dr. Miller," Silas announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "He will see to the boy." Before Eliza could protest or even properly thank him, Silas had gently lifted Leo from her arms and handed him over to the doctor. "Take him inside to the west bedroom. Maria has it prepared." Eliza scrambled down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. "I should go with him." "All in good time, Mrs. Thompson," Silas said, placing a firm but gentle hand on her arm. His touch was warm, but it sent a strange chill through her. "Let the doctor do his work. Maria will show you to your room. You must be exhausted." A woman emerged from the house. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face etched with lines of quiet resignation. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, held a flicker of something Eliza couldn't quite decipher. Pity, perhaps, or warning. "This is Maria, my housekeeper," Silas said. "She will see to your needs. Maria, this is Mrs. Eliza Thompson." Maria nodded, her expression unreadable. "Welcome, Ma'am," she said, her voice low and heavily accented. She looked at Eliza's tattered dress, and the dust caked on her skin, but her face registered no judgment. "Come, I will draw you a bath." The inside of the house was even more overwhelming than the outside. The air smelled of beeswax and roasted meat. Polished wood floors gleamed under the light from large glass windows. A grand staircase swept upwards to the second floor. It was a world away from her dark, cramped Soddy, a different planet entirely. Maria led her to a room at the top of the stairs. It was beautiful, with a large 4-poster bed draped in a handmade quilt, a wardrobe of dark carved wood, and a small writing desk by a window that overlooked the thriving fields. On the bed, laid out with impossible care, was a simple but elegant dress of dark blue cotton, along with new undergarments and a pair of soft leather slippers. "Mr. Blackwood thought you might wish for a change of clothes," Maria said, her gaze averted as she moved to a small adjacent room to prepare the bath. Eliza touched the fabric of the dress. It was soft clean. The thought of washing away the grime of the past weeks, of shedding her ragged clothes like a dead skin, was an almost unbearable luxury. The bath was a basin of steaming soap-scented water, more water than she had used for washing in a month. As she sank into its warmth, the exhaustion and tension of her ordeal began to seep away, replaced by a profound, disorienting sense of peace. For the first time in a year, she felt safe. Later clean and dressed in the new clothes, she found Leo sleeping soundly in the room across the hall. The doctor had given him a broth and a mild sedative. His fever had already begun to break. His breathing was deeper and more even. Watching him sleep in the soft bed, his small face relaxed and peaceful, Eliza felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought her to her knees. Silas Blackwood had saved them. He had performed a miracle. The days that followed felt like a dream. Leo recovered with astonishing speed, his cheeks regaining their color, his laughter echoing in the large, quiet house. They ate 3 full meals a day at a long, polished dining table with Silas. The food was plentiful and delicious: roasted chicken, thick steaks, fresh bread, apple pie. Silas was a charming host, telling stories of his travels back east, asking Eliza about her life in Ohio, careful to avoid the painful topic of her time at the homestead. He treated Leo with a gentle paternal affection, bringing him a beautifully illustrated book of fables and showing him the foals in the stables. The boy, starved for a father figure, began to idolize him. Yet as the initial euphoria wore off, a subtle disquiet began to creep into the edges of Eliza's consciousness. The ranch, for all its life and productivity, was eerily silent. The dozen or so ranch hands worked with a grim, machine-like efficiency. They were well-fed and well-clothed, but they never smiled. They spoke in low tones, their eyes perpetually downcast. When Eliza tried to greet them, they would offer a mumbled pleasantry and quickly find a reason to be elsewhere. They seemed to be ghosts in their own home, moving through the world without leaving a mark. Maria, too, was a source of quiet unease. She was kind, always ensuring Eliza and Leo had what they needed, but she was a fortress of solitude. She deflected personal questions with practiced ease. One afternoon, as Eliza was helping her shell peas on the veranda, she tried to broach the subject. "Mr. Blackwood has been so good to us," Eliza began. "It's a remarkable thing, his generosity." Maria's hands didn't stop their rhythmic work. "Mr. Blackwood is a man who knows what he wants, ma'am," she said, her voice flat. "And he is a man who gets what he wants." "He seems to have built a paradise here," Eliza pressed gently. Maria paused, a single pea held between her thumb and forefinger. She looked out over the perfect green fields, but her eyes seemed to see something else entirely. "Even the Garden of Eden had a serpent," she murmured so quietly Eliza wasn't sure she'd heard it right. Then, as if realizing she had said too much, she stood abruptly. "The bread will be burning." She disappeared back into the house, leaving Eliza alone with her words hanging in the still air. Silas's attention at first, a comforting balm, began to feel stifling. He took an intense interest in every aspect of her life. He would compliment the way she arranged her hair, but then suggest another style he preferred. He discouraged her from walking too far from the main house, citing concerns for her safety. Rattlesnakes, he said, or rogue coyotes. But the reasons felt thin. The ranch was so orderly, so controlled, it was hard to imagine anything being out of place. It felt less like protection and more like confinement. The feeling of being watched was constant. Whether she was reading to Leo on the veranda or mending a tear in his shirt, she would look up to find Silas standing in a doorway, or by a window simply observing her. His expression was always the same, that intense proprietary gaze she had first seen at the homestead. It was the look of a man admiring a prized possession. The true jarring note of discord came a week after their arrival. Maria had done their laundry, and as she was putting away Eliza's clothes in the large wooden wardrobe, she noticed a section at the very back she hadn't explored. Behind a row of other new dresses Silas had provided, there was another garment hanging by itself in a canvas dust cover. Curious, she unfastened it. Inside was a dress of exquisite quality, made of pale lavender silk, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It was more beautiful than any dress Eliza had ever seen. It was also distinctly not new. It had the faint, sweet scent of lavender sachet and thyme. It was an heirloom, carefully and lovingly preserved. Puzzled, she took it from the wardrobe. It was her size. Exactly her size. As she held it up against herself, a terrifying, impossible thought struck her. It was not just her size. It was made for her frame, for her height, for the slope of her shoulders. It would fit her as if she had been measured for it by a master tailor. Her heart began to pound. This wasn't a gift. This was a replacement. She was not just a guest in this house. She was filling a space left by someone else. Her eyes darted around the beautiful, comfortable room, but now she saw it differently. The soft bed, the sturdy furniture, the view of the perfect green fields. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage, a beautiful gilded cage. And the door had just clicked shut behind her. The lavender silk dress lay pooled on the floor where Eliza had dropped it, its shimmering fabric looking like a pool of moonlight in the dim room. The scent of old lavender and secrets filled her lungs. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum, now felt like a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The gilded cage now had a name, a history. She was a replacement. She and Leo were living in a dead woman's clothes, sleeping in a dead family's beds. Her first instinct was to confront Maria. She found the housekeeper in the kitchen, her hands methodically kneading dough, her face a familiar mask of stoicism. Eliza held up the dress, her hand shaking. "Maria, what is this? Whose was it?" For the first time, Eliza saw a crack in Maria's composure. The housekeeper's dark eyes widened in genuine fear. She darted a look towards the hallway, as if expecting Silas to materialize from the shadows. She snatched the dress from Eliza's hand, her movements jerky and panicked. "You should not have this," she hissed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Put it away. Forget you ever saw it. For your own good. For the boys." "I can't forget it," Eliza insisted, her own voice rising with a desperate edge. "Who was she? The woman who wore this?" Maria's face crumpled, the years of forced silence collapsing in an instant. "Her name was Lillian." She whispered the name itself, seeming to cause her pain. She stuffed the dress back into its canvas cover. She was his wife. Now please, Senora, do not ask me more. The walls have ears, and his ears are the sharpest of all. She turned her back, her shoulders rigid, a clear and final dismissal. The fear in Maria's eyes was more terrifying than any threat. It was the fear of a long-term prisoner who knows the warden's every mood. Eliza knew then that she was truly on her own. The need to understand, to uncover the truth of what happened to Lillian Blackwood, became a burning obsession. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about survival. She had to know the nature of the trap she had walked into before it sprang shut on her and Leo. She became a ghost in the house, a creature of shadows and silence. During the day, she played the part Silas had cast for her, the grateful widow, the doting mother. She smiled. She read to Leo. She sat on the veranda and allowed Silas's watchful gaze to rest upon her. But every smile was a lie, every moment of calm a performance. Her mind was constantly working, observing, mapping the house and its routines. She learned that Silas spent his mornings riding the vast expanses of his property and his afternoons in a locked study at the end of the west wing, a part of the house she had been tacitly discouraged from entering. This study became the focal point of her investigation. The truth she felt certain was behind that door. The opportunity came during a rare, violent thunderstorm that swept through the valley one afternoon. The sky turned a bruised purple gray, and rain lashed against the windows. The ranch hands were hunkered in the bunkhouse, and the clap of thunder was loud enough to mask any sound she might make. Silas, seeing Leo was frightened by the storm, had taken the boy to the stables to show him how the horses remained calm, a gesture of paternal care that now seemed sinister to Eliza. She knew she had little time. Heart pounding, she made her way to the west wing. The door to the study was, as expected, locked. But in her careful observations, she had noticed that Silas kept a ring of keys on a hook just inside the main hall closet, keys for the smokehouse, the pantry, and other outbuildings. She had prayed one might fit. Her hands trembled as she tried them one by one. The first two were too large. The third, a small, ornate brass key, slid into the lock. With a faint click that was lost in a peal of thunder, the lock turned. She slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The room was Silas's sanctuary, a hyper-masculine space filled with the scent of leather tobacco and old paper. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, littered with ledgers and maps of the ranch. But Eliza's eyes were drawn to the far wall above the cold fireplace. Hanging there was a large, oil-painted portrait, and in the portrait was a woman with Eliza's face. The shock was a physical blow stealing the air from her lungs. It wasn't a passing resemblance. It was her. The same auburn hair, the same green eyes, the same shape of the face and line of the jaw. The woman in the portrait was wearing the lavender silk dress, and her expression was one of gentle, serene happiness. A small brass plaque on the frame read, "Lillian Blackwood, 1881. Eliza felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, of unreality. It was no wonder Silas had stopped his horse at her homestead. He hadn't seen a desperate widow. He had seen a ghost. Frantically, she began to scan the room, searching for more. On a small side table next to a silver box sat a leather-bound book, a diary. Its cover was embossed with the single initial L. Her fingers shaking, she opened it. The handwriting was a graceful, flowing script. She didn't have time to read it all, so she flipped through the pages, her eyes catching dates and phrases that painted a story of love turning to madness. 1880. Silas is the most wonderful man I have ever known. He brought me to this wild country and promised to build me a kingdom. Looking at what he has already accomplished, I believe him. He looks at me as if I am the sun and moon. She flipped forward a year, the entries still happy, filled with news of the birth of their son. June 1881. Little Thomas has his father's blue eyes. Silas is so proud he could burst. He holds him so carefully as if he is made of spun glass. He says he finally has everything he has ever wanted. A kingdom, a queen, and a prince. The tone began to shift a year later. The script was tighter, more hurried. September 1882. Silas's love has become heavy. He hates for me to ride out alone. He dismissed the new ranch hand today, simply because the young man paid me a compliment on my baking. He says he is only protecting me, that the world is a dangerous place. But sometimes his protection feels like a pêche. January 1883. We had a terrible argument. I wanted to visit my sister in St. Louis. He forbade it. He said our place was here together, that everything we needed was at Blackwood Creek. He looked at me with such intensity and said, "I will not lose you, Lillian. I will never lose you." His words were meant to be a comfort, but they sounded like a threat. The final entries were from the spring of 1883. They were blotched, as if with tears. April 1883. Thomas has the fever. Dr. Miller is doing all he can, but he is so very weak. Silas has not left his side. He just sits there, watching him, his face like stone. He blames himself. He says he should have built the house higher, further from the damp air of the creek. April 1883. I feel I am disappearing. Silas no longer sees me. He sees only his fear. He started talking of the future, a future where everything is perfect and safe, where no one can ever leave. It frightens me. My love for the willow grove down by the creek is my only solace. It is the only place his eyes are not on me. The last entry was a single, chilling sentence. May 1st, 1883. The fever has broken, but Silas says we must remain quarantined. He has locked the door. He says it is for our own safety. He says we will all be together forever. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Eliza's head snapped up. Silas was back. She shoved the diary back onto the table, her mind racing. She had to get out. As she turned, her eyes caught the silver box next to the diary. On instinct, she grabbed it, tucked it into the pocket of her apron, and slipped out of the study, locking the door behind her, just as Silas and Leo's voices rounded the far corner. She was back in her room, heart hammering, when he knocked on the door to tell her the storm had passed. Later that night, when the house was still and silent, she opened the silver box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a silver locket. She opened it. On one side was a miniature of Lillian. On the other, a picture of a small, blonde-haired boy with startlingly blue eyes. Thomas. He was the spitting image of her own Leo. The final piece of the puzzle mentioned in the diary clicked into place with dreadful certainty. The willow grove down by the creek. The next day, feigning a headache and a need for fresh air, she excused herself and made her way from the house, following the path of the life-giving creek. She found the grove easily a peaceful shaded spot where a cluster of old willow trees drooped their branches into the slow-moving water. The air was cool and quiet. It was a beautiful place, a place of solace. And there, under the largest willow, almost completely hidden by overgrown grass, were 2 mounds of earth. They were unmistakably graves. They were marked not with proper headstones, but with simple flat river stones dragged from the creek. One was larger, the other heartbreakingly small. Lillian and Thomas. They hadn't gone back east. They hadn't run away. They had never left. The truth washed over Eliza in a wave of ice-cold horror. Silas Blackwood's grief hadn't just broken his heart, it had shattered his mind. He wasn't a simple kidnapper or a villain from a dime novel. He was a man locked in a battle with the past, a man so desperate to rewrite his own tragic history that he had sought out living replacements for his dead family. He wasn't just offering her a new life. He was forcing her to live an old one. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone what happened to those who tried to deviate from the script. The journey back from the Willow Grove was a walk through a waking grave. The world had inverted. The vibrant green of the ranch now seemed grotesque, a garish mask on a skull, and the warm sun felt like the heat from a pyre. The 2 mounds of earth beneath the drooping branches were burned into Eliza's mind, not as a tragedy, but as a prophecy. Lillian and Thomas, a woman who looked like her, a boy who looked like her son. They were her future if she failed. When she returned to the house, Silas was on the veranda, rocking gently, a picture of paternal peace with Leo playing at his feet. He smiled as she approached, a wide, beatific smile that held no awareness of the horror she had just witnessed. It was the smile of a man gazing upon his own private, perfect heaven. "There you are, my dear," he called, his voice rich with contentment. "I was beginning to worry." This was her first test. The urge to scream, to run, to point a trembling finger and accuse him was a physical force inside her. But one look at Leo, so innocent and small at the madman's feet, smothered the impulse. Survival was a mask, and she had to wear it flawlessly. She forced her lips into a return smile, a brittle thing she feared might crack. "The air did me a world of good, Silas," she said, the lie slipping out with horrifying ease. "It is so wonderfully peaceful here." "Peaceful," he repeated, savoring the word as if it were a fine wine. "It is, isn't it? Everything a person could ever need." His blue eyes, clear and unclouded by guilt, held hers. He truly believed it. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of bones and saw it only as a sanctuary. From that moment on, Eliza's life became a performance. She was the lead actress in a play for an audience of one, a play where the script was a dead woman's life and the penalty for a missed cue was the grave. She learned to be a ghost, to echo the opinions and desires of a woman she had never met. When Silas remarked, "You always did love roses, didn't you, my love?" she would agree with a gentle smile, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. He watched her constantly, his gaze both adoring and scrutinizing. He would comment on the smallest things. "You're holding your fork differently," he noted once, a faint frown line appearing between his brows. "You always used to be so delicate." Panic flared hot and sharp. "How many other tells were there? I suppose I'm just so hungry," she had said, forcing a light laugh. "The food is so wonderful I forget my manners." The explanation seemed to satisfy him, but the lesson was learned. She couldn't just replace Lillian. She had to become her. While playing the part of the contented matriarch, Eliza became a spy in her own prison. She needed a plan, an escape route from this gilded cage. Her walks with Leo became reconnaissance missions, slowly mapping the ranch's layout. She feigned an interest in its operations, asking Silas innocent questions about the cattle, the irrigation, and the routines of the ranch hands. The hands themselves were a silent, fearful wall. They were well-fed prisoners who had traded their freedom for 3 meals a day, and they guarded their grim Hagen with averted eyes and mumbled pleasantries. No help would come from them. Her only hope was Maria. The housekeeper was a fortress of silent sorrow, but Eliza sensed a shared captivity. She began to spend more time in the kitchen, not asking questions, but helping creating a space of shared, quiet labor. For a week, Maria remained withdrawn. Then one afternoon, while folding laundry, Eliza commented softly, "My mother had a quilt much like this one." Maria paused. "My grandmother taught me to quilt," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "She said you can tell a person's life story from the scraps they choose." It was a tiny crack in the wall of her silence. The true breakthrough came with the arrival of the monthly supply wagon from Dust Devil Gulch. Driven by a grizzled old man named Ezra, it was the ranch's only regular link to the outside world. Later in the kitchen, Eliza watched Maria put away the new sacks of flour. "I suppose the wagon comes quite often," she remarked casually. "Once a month," Maria said her back to Eliza. "Always on the third Tuesday. Ezra is the only one Mr. Blackwood trusts to come onto the property. He minds his own business." The third Tuesday. The information was a jolt of pure electricity. A date. A schedule. The first solid piece of a plan began to form in Eliza's mind. That night, the psychological pressure of her role intensified dramatically. Silas appeared in the doorway of Leo's room as she was tucking her son into bed. He was holding the lavender silk dress. "I was thinking," he said, his voice soft and persuasive, "that you might wear this for dinner tomorrow night. To celebrate. It has been far too long since I've seen you in it." Eliza stared at the dress, the beautiful, terrible shroud of the woman she was forced to be. It was not a request. It was a command. This was the next step in his suffocating delusion. He wanted to see his wife whole and perfect, sitting across the table from him once more. "It's beautiful, Silas," she managed to say, her throat tight with unshed screams. "It was always my favorite," he said, stepping into the room and laying it carefully on the foot of the bed. His eyes fell on Leo, now fast asleep. He reached out and brushed a lock of hair from the boy's forehead, his expression growing distant. "He's a strong boy," Silas murmured, his gaze turning inward to a place of dark memory. "So much stronger this time." He looked at Eliza, and a flicker of something cold and sharp, a sliver of the madness beneath the calm, crossed his face. "We won't make the same mistakes again, my love. I won't let anything happen to either of you. You are safe here. You will be with me. Forever." The final word hung in the air like a death sentence delivered as a vow of love. He left the room, leaving the dress behind its silken fabric, seeming to absorb all the warmth from the air. Eliza stood, frozen, her blood like ice in her veins. "This time." The words echoed in the terrifying silence. He wasn't just reliving the past. He was actively trying to correct it. He believed he had been given a second chance by a divine providence to get it right, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the very marrow of her bones what happened to the people who were part of his first failed attempt. The third Tuesday was 6 days away. She looked from the lavender dress, her costume for the final act, to her sleeping son. For the next 6 days, her performance would have to be flawless. She would become Lillian Blackwood in mind, body, and soul. Because on the third Tuesday, Eliza Thompson and her son were going to escape. Or they were going to join Lillian and Thomas in the cold, silent earth beneath the willow trees. The final 6 days were a descent into a waking nightmare. Eliza became a consummate actress, her life a stage where a single misspoken line would mean death. Each morning, she woke up with the chilling realization of who she had to be. Lillian Blackwood, a ghost resurrected. She wore the dead woman's lavender silk dress to dinner, its fabric cold against her skin, a constant reminder of the tomb she inhabited. She learned to smile when her heart was screaming to laugh lightly at Silas's shared memories of a past she had only read about in a diary. His adoration was a suffocating blanket, his eyes following her with a proprietary glee that turned her blood to ice. He was a man meticulously rebuilding his shattered paradise, and she was the unwilling centerpiece, the final perfect piece of his delusion. Her plan was a fragile, desperate thing, a house of cards built on the hope of a terrified housekeeper's courage, and the sheer luck that a tired wagon driver would not notice two fugitives hidden among his cargo. The key was the poppy tincture Maria kept for toothaches. A few drops would plunge both her beloved son and her monstrous captor into a deep artificial sleep, giving her the window she needed to flee. The night before the supply wagon's scheduled departure, Eliza sought out Maria in the quiet kitchen. The air was warm with the scent of baking bread, a scent of home and safety that mocked her reality. "Maria," Eliza began, her voice a strained whisper, "I need the poppy tincture." Maria went rigid, a dishcloth clutched in her white-knuckled fist. Fear, stark and primal, flared in her dark eyes. "Senora, no. For what reason? It is for Leo." Eliza lied, the falsehood feeling clumsy on her tongue. "He has nightmares. He cries out in his sleep, and this will give him a peaceful night." For a long moment, Maria simply stared, her gaze boring into Eliza, stripping away the lie to see the raw, unvarnished truth of her desperation. She saw the flight, the risk, the sheer terror. The housekeeper's face was a canvas of conflict. The ingrained fear of Silas warring with the deep-seated empathy of a woman who had witnessed too much sorrow. With a shuddering breath that sounded like a sob, Maria's resolve broke. She turned without a word, her movement stiff and robotic, and retrieved the small blue bottle from its hiding place. Pressing it into Eliza's trembling hand, her own fingers were like ice. "Be careful, Senora," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It is a powerful gift. A little brings peace, too much brings a peace that never ends." It was more than a warning. It was a prayer. With that whispered blessing, Eliza knew she was not entirely alone. The following evening played out in a surreal slow-motion haze. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. With hands that shook uncontrollably, she poured the milk. 3 drops of the dark tincture for Leo, a heavier, more generous 6 drops for Silas. Her son, in his innocence, drank his portion without a second thought. Silas, however, sipped his. Slowly, his eyes fixed on her over the rim of the glass, with an intensity that made her feel like a butterfly pinned to a board. "It is good to see you so content, Lillian," he murmured, his voice a low purr of satisfaction. "It is all I ever dreamed of." "I am content," she echoed the words, nearly choking her. She saw Leo to his bed first. By the time she had tucked the covers around him, the opiate had already claimed him, pulling him into a deep, untroubled slumber. She returned to the dining room. Silas was slumped forward in his chair, his head resting on the polished wood of the table. His grand dream dissolving into a drugged unconsciousness. Her first hurdle was cleared. Now the real terror began. Wrapping the sleeping Leo in a heavy blanket, she lifted him into her arms. His small, limp body was a precious, terrifying weight. She grabbed her satchel containing Caleb's whittled horse and Lillian's diary and slipped out into the moonless night. Maria was a silent spectre by the kitchen door, offering a single sharp nod of farewell before disappearing back into the shadows. The supply wagon stood near the stables, a dark shape against the slightly less dark sky. With agonizing slowness that stretched her nerves to their breaking point, Eliza pulled back the heavy canvas flap. She gently laid Leo inside, tucking him behind a large, empty water barrel. She clambered in after him, pulling the canvas closed, plunging them into a suffocating, absolute blackness. The world ceased to exist, replaced by the smell of dust and mule sweat, and the frantic, hammering beat of her own heart. The hours she spent waiting were the longest of her life, each minute a separate eternity filled with the imagined sounds of Silas waking. Just as the first hint of dawn began to bleed through the canvas, she heard it the crunch of boots on gravel. Ezra. The wagon lurched as he hitched the mules, his grunts and curses echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. Then, with a crack of a whip, they were moving. The journey was excruciatingly slow. After an age, she risked a peek outside. The grand house, her prison, was gone. The impossibly green fields had given way to the familiar desolate plains. They were free. The relief was so intense it was dizzying. But it was premature. A sound, faint at first, then growing inexorably louder, reached her ears. Hoofbeats. Not the weary plodding of mules, but the urgent, desperate gallop of a horse being pushed to its absolute limit. Silas. Her blood ran cold. She risked another look. A lone rider was silhouetted against the rising sun, closing the distance with terrifying speed. "Ezra!" she screamed, scrambling from her hiding place, pulling a bewildered Leo with her. "Faster! For the love of God! He's coming!" The old driver turned his weathered face, a mask of shock at the sudden appearance of his stowaways. He looked from Eliza's wild-eyed panic to the rapidly approaching rider, and a grim understanding dawned. He asked no questions. He laid his whip across the mules' backs, and the wagon lurched forward with renewed urgency. But it was a futile effort. They were a draft horse, racing a thoroughbred. Silas was gaining. She could see his face now, a mask of tormented fury. "Lillian!" His voice tore across the empty space, a cry of anguish and rage. "You can't leave me again!" Dust Devil Gulch appeared on the horizon, a handful of buildings that represented salvation. But it was too far. Eliza's eyes scanned the wagon bed, searching for a weapon, a miracle. She saw only the heavy water barrel Leo had been hiding behind. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, she heaved it toward the back of the wagon. It tipped over the edge, landing squarely in the path of Silas's charging horse. The animal, unable to stop, tripped and went down with a sickening shriek, throwing Silas from the saddle. He landed hard, tumbling in a cloud of dust. Ezra didn't hesitate, whipping the mules into the dusty main street of the town and pulling up before the sheriff's office. As people poured into the street, Sheriff Brody emerged. "It's him," Eliza gasped, thrusting Lillian's diary into his hands. "Silas Blackwood. He kept us prisoner. The proof is in there. He buried his wife and child on his ranch." The sheriff looked from her face to the diary, then to the solitary, broken figure of Silas, stumbling toward them. Silas saw the sheriff, saw the armed townsfolk, and he knew. His meticulously crafted reality had shattered into a million pieces. He stopped his shoulders, slumping in utter defeat, a king whose phantom kingdom had vanished in the light of day. The aftermath was swift. a posse discovered the two graves beneath the willow tree. Maria, finally free to speak, corroborated every word of Eliza's story. For a week, Eliza and Leo rested in Dust Devil Gulch, enveloped by the kindness of strangers. With a small purse collected for them, they boarded an eastbound stagecoach, turning their backs on the ghosts of the Texas Panhandle. As the desolate landscape receded, Eliza held her son tight. They had walked through the heart of a madman's dream and emerged into the light. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in an eternity, it was their own. Eliza and Leo's escape from the gilded cage of Blackwood Creek Ranch wasn't just a flight to freedom. It was a reclamation of their own story. They walked out of the shadow of a ghost and into the light of an unknown future. Silas Blackwood's story serves as a haunting reminder that the deepest prisons are often the ones we build in our own minds, brick by brick, with grief and obsession. The Wild West was full of tales of survival, but Eliza's is a testament to the strength of a mother's love and the unbreakable will of the human spirit to choose its own identity, even when faced with the most terrifying of phantoms. What did you think of Eliza's harrowing ordeal? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories of survival drama and the dark side of the American frontier, be sure to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more tales from the untamed West.